So today we're talking about ethics in DeSci, and basically in pretty much most walks of life, especially corporate industry, there is some kind of ethical review board or some kind of code of ethics. You have it in medicine, you have it in data science, you have it everywhere. Currently in DeSci, a very nascent industry, there isn't really a code of ethics that anyone has come up with that the entire space agrees with, or even multiple different projects agree with. So I think it's important that we discuss this with the leaders of the space here, about what is ethics, what it means for DeSci, and how we might implement an ethical sort of framework for the space. So I'm going to pass over to the panelists to let them introduce themselves. I'm going to start here with Martin.
Yeah, hi folks, my name is Martin Codire. I'm one of the co-founders of Fleming Protocols, and we're kind of allowing patient groups to leverage their desire to solve problems within their domains and all the data that gets produced during clinical interventions, and then leverage that to expand the product into a more commercial offering. I'm a neuroscience and engineer by background, and I'm very committed to the patient perspective of things. So I'm really translational. I view all sides as, from my perspective, as that how does that get translated into an outcome for patients, but also for society in general.
Yep, that's great. My name is Chris Burns. I'm an IP legal advisor at Molecule and an IP lawyer involved with a number of the different BioDAOs that we see emerging. My background, in addition, I have a physics background, and my sort of IP law work arises from that space. But I have a master's in theology, in religion, ethics, and politics as well, which doesn't always come in so usefully for being an IP lawyer, but delighted to be on a panel where we can talk about ethics and DeSci without even me having to just be talking about IP all the time. And so I'm particularly interested to those ends in how the property rights that arise from decentralized science, things like IP, but the cultural movement behind DeSci more generally, how it can be encoded with ethics and with ethical encumbrances that are actually contractually enforceable. I've done a lot of work in the human rights space and with environmental protection as well, and there's a lot of in centralized government, or with centralized business, corporations will oftentimes want to take an approach to corporate social responsibility that just becomes a pledge and isn't binding. I'm really excited about DeSci in a way to change that.
Thank you. I'm Nicholas. I'm a founder of LabDAO. I'm a physician by training and a computational biologist. At LabDAO, we care a lot about making tools available for scientists all over the world to especially run computational biology workflows, but then also give them the availability of wet lab resources when they have a test. So usually, if you were a computational biologist, you could work from wherever you are, but only for so long as you really want, as you sort of hit a point where you want to test your hypothesis, and you need to find someone with access to a physical lab to collaborate with. And we want to make that way more easy for the computational side to find someone who can do the work. And then obviously, we have questions around who should be able to have access to physical laboratory space. What is the biosecurity risk of giving broad access to some of these resources? And then on the other hand, also some questions around IP. How can an online community or an actor within an online community that has done most of their work within a Jupyter notebook, how can they capture some of the value? Is IP even the right tool for that, or should we just think about basically software companies? Those are some questions that we think about quite a bit.
Hi, my name is Starmi Kini, and I'm the core lead over at Athena DAO. We're a decentralized community working to fund women's health research. For us in the DAO, one of the biggest things that we think of around ethics is the fact that women's health data is very important to be protected, especially because of reproductive justice. So when we're thinking of data assets, we're also thinking how are we going to make sure that we protect this data. What kind of new technology can we use to make sure that it doesn't get used for surveillance, especially in certain markets? So I'm glad to be talking about this particular subject today.
Thank you. So as you can hear, there are many different ethical considerations for this space, each individual to the project. So the dictionary definition for ethics is the moral principles that govern a person's behavior, or the branch of knowledge that deals with moral principles. This is a moral question largely, but also comes down to much more specific areas. Each project here has just mentioned IP, we've got data protection, we've got handling of data transfers. So I'm going to ask everybody here on the panel to briefly define ethics in DeSci, what it means to you, what it means to your project.
Yeah, I sometimes get confused between the difference between ethics and morals, actually. But from my perspective, I look at things from with the patient side of things as a risk-reward payoff. So what level of risk is a patient willing to take personally? But also, I've seen a lot of projects kind of get stalled because the institutions that kind of traditionally deliver or disseminate technologies are concerned about reputational risk as opposed to actual risk to the patient themselves or their health risk. And patients aren't really that concerned about reputational risk. They want to see products that help themselves and that cure diseases, really. So I think that there's a line there that you have to kind of acknowledge that patient groups, we want to see celebrated entities taking risks, reputational risks, because without taking those risks, we're not going to figure out what does work in humans. And I was chatting earlier on to people about the gene therapy field. And the gene therapy field suffered a major setback about 10, 15 years ago, with a famous case of a guy called Jesse Gelsinger, who was one of the very, very first patients that was ever involved in a clinical trial. And unfortunately, this guy died. He was one member of the trial, and he died because of a specific, I think it was a mutation in one of his genes that didn't function well with gene therapy. But this held the entire field back over 10 years, and no one was willing to touch it at all because they considered it too risky to their careers. Now, this patient was only one of quite a few, and the therapy actually worked in quite a few of the other members of the trial. So you've got to look at that and say, well, why are we 10 years behind the curve with gene therapies because of reputational risk for the entities and the people that were trying to do this? Patients don't really care about that. They care about personal risk. And in this kind of research that I was doing around this, I found a term called micromort, which is a 1 in a million chance of dying. And on any given day, all of us experience 1 micromort. So if you go for a skydive, that's 10 micromorts. A general anesthetic is also 10 micromorts. So you're basically spending 10 days of your life doing taking risk. You're accelerating that in 1 day. And that's a framework that I actually like to think about within, is it ethical to put a patient at risk of a certain number of micromorts, given that a lot of those patients would do skydives anyway, so they're taking risks with their bodies anyway. So I like to almost quantify it in that regard.
Yeah, so I mean, when you're sort of debating whether or not accelerationism is something that should happen or not, it's not specific to ethics, it's specific to all walks of life. Accelerationism is something that we consider quite, it's got its positives and its drawbacks. However, when it comes to DeSci, a lot of this data, a lot of this work is being done in particular with patient focus, medicine, healthcare, and accelerationism in these areas does bring a lot of ethical considerations. And Martin has given one side of it. I'm going to warn you, I don't think this panel will come together with a final solution on what ethics should be, but it's important to raise these issues and to see all sides. Laura, can you please tell us what Athena DAO, what ethics means to Athena DAO in particular with women's reproductive health?
I would say that one of the most important things is that women do get the upside of things rather than just being exploited for either the data or consumer as. I don't know if you saw in the chat yesterday, I showed you this product that it was $2.99 to test menopause. It's not I mean, we were talking about why this is not an effective product, and it's just more of a gimmick, something that we're selling to women because they're desperate. They want to know that they're going through that period, nobody's giving them enough information, so they'll buy those products that in a way exploit them. So a lot of what we think about is how can we work with researchers or startups that are really trying to do this to help women rather just to make money from women. And then there's the aspect of, as I said, reproductive justice. In the US now, some of the apps were actually tracking data that they were selling for when women were having their periods. And this is a way to monitor women. So when we're thinking about research and collecting data, is how do we protect this women's data? How do we make sure that it's used for something that benefits them rather than just benefit companies? And I'm not against companies or actually having businesses, but how do we make them better for women in general? Also for the researchers to get the upside from their scientific research. I think one of the big things that happens is that sometimes scientists don't realize they have a gold pot and somebody who's doing business study comes and takes it over. How do you actually give them the tools to protect their IP, their intellectual property, and their research in a good way? So one of the things that we're discussing right now in the DAO is what is the limit of what we show to the community, because some of this research is proprietary. So you cannot be voting on things that other researcher could come and adapt and then make it his own research. That's one of the big things that we're discussing.
Chris, maybe you could touch on that a little bit about the IP in particular and sort of protecting that and the ethical considerations for a decentralized infrastructure in protecting that IP.
Yeah, definitely. So the World Intellectual Property Organization estimates IP in the modern economy to be worth around 63 trillion. It's about 80% of the balance sheets of all Fortune 500 companies. And that's changed dramatically. If you look 40 years ago, intangible assets were maybe 20% of the balance sheet. But we're in this economy now where intellectual property is probably the most pervasive, dominant asset class in any supply chain, in any value chain. And from an ethics perspective, I think we have to ask, one, we need to locate ourselves in this system, and all of us, I'm sure, in this room, our paychecks come because we're IP producers in some meaning of the word, at least from kind of a political economy perspective on the law. All the knowledge we produce, everything that we're doing in DeSci is how to democratize IP, co-govern IP. It's all built on a technology platform that, again, itself is IP protected. The ethical debates to date in the pre-kind of Web3 world have largely been about how do we privatize and maximize, and we see all types of concerns that arise around monopoly pricing coming from large pharma, other things like this. And then the alternative is sort of this digital flip to just saying, open source everything, put everything into the public domain. And there's an ethical position that anyone takes by nature, really by whether one chooses to have the terms upon which we create, the terms upon which we put our intellectual property into the economy have ethical implications. And I think where we can go with Web3 and with DeSci to make a much more robust and kind of interesting social conversation than what had happened in Web 2 and with really free and open source software, is to start to really think about structural inequities in the economy, things like patterns of disparity in pay between, gender bias, who gets to benefit, maybe connecting things back to historically marginalized communities who've long been stewarding the knowledge that is now being sort of commercially developed. We see this in psychedelics come up often. I really think the key thing from an ethics perspective in DeSci, from an IP perspective as well then, is really to think critically about what are our own terms of creation. What conditions and encumbrances might we want to put on the intellectual property that we create and co-govern and co-steward in a DAO, and actually put those conditions explicitly, name, put them onto IP licenses, and see how we can start to transform the broader economy with these strategic economic interventions into things that are really about structural bias.
Yeah, thank you. What you mentioned about making a choice between whether or not you go to a traditional IP route or you go through an open sourcing route, this is a frame that we've sort of been born into. And the idea that I would like to see with DeSci is to maybe redefine this framing such that IP could be a different concept that doesn't require full, continuous, multi-year ownership dedicated to a single person or a single organization. What open source doesn't necessarily mean giving up all of your property straight away for very little fee. I know, Nicholas, at LabDAO, you guys have a lot of considerations about this open sourcing in terms of safety. Would you like to touch on that?
Yeah, I can talk about safety, but maybe for a moment I would actually like to stay in that topic realm because it's very close to us as well. So one of our core activities is we go and we curate work from machine learning and computational biologists, oftentimes grad students if they would these under an MIT license. And this work is extremely valuable. It's fairly consumable. There are a lot of companies, oftentimes located in countries outside of the region where that work was done, that take advantage of that work. And to take advantage, I think, has to be said carefully. It's not in the sense that there's any like bad intent here. It's just this is an extremely useful tool. It accelerates humanity, this ability to like solve some of the trickiest problems, and there's a lot of value that's created. Something that I have been struggling with personally has been the question like, how can I still share publicly, but I create a unit of account for what I have done and what I've shared publicly. And I think Web3 has just been this really interesting testing ground to see what happens when we create new units of account, new tokens of account, while radically also sharing everything open source. So Vitalik Buterin has this blog post which got relatively famous. It's called "Legitimacy is the Scarcest Resource." And I'm just giving a quick anecdote here for everybody that's new to this particular field. There's a technology that's called automated market makers. It's a way that you can swap tokens one for the next. The first one, the team that really built that first iteration of the code was called Uniswap. And then a couple of weeks later, a competitor came along and basically copied that code, made some small changes, and it's called SushiSwap. Now, people are still stuck with Uniswap, although there was really no economic reason why they should have stayed with it. And this is really, I think, legitimacy, and everybody has a sort of sense of ethics and has a sense of, okay, this is the team that has sort of developed the technology initially, and they have a certain amount of legitimacy in being the ones that keep driving this technology, keep driving this product forward. And if I own this particular token, I actually share more in the value creation, although there's been a competitor on the place. And I think if we can get to something similar, and with just generally the way that we create open source software, I think it would be a really interesting experiment to see that if a graduate student or a postdoc creates a really interesting model at a hackathon or just during their studies, and they launch some kind of impact certificate similar to the way that we issue carbon certificates for that particular work, then that could be a shelling point of like preferential attachment of capital and other resources around that work, where people say, yes, you might be a junior PhD student, and yes, you might not have the business acumen, but you have an asset that I can attach value to, and I'm concentrating around you, and I'd rather want to work with you than sort of just command C and work with it somewhere else. So this was a sort of a bit of an exploration to the IP space, where I'm really interested in finding ways in which we can, also change the way that we think about IP and use tokens as sort of the carbon certificate of intellectual property. The next the next question you asked was the biosafety. Now, actually, I think there's the good news is there are laws, and people have thought about this for quite some time. So first thing is you adhere to the law, and a lot of the ethical questions are sort of taken care of in that way. You have to know who is using any particular, especially physical tool. So people need to be KYC'd. They need to know who they are. In certain instances, if they want to do certain work, they need to have additional qualifications. And I think what I believe is extremely exciting is to look into technologies that enable one to demonstrate the certificates or whatever attributes one has that allow one to use certain tools in a way that is more and more independent of the sort of intermediating institutions. For example, we all usually, when we go through a graduate school experience, one of the reasons why we do that is because maybe we want to apply for public grants to eventually receive funding. However, you could also argue that someone who has 5,000 stars on GitHub should probably be able to write a grant application to the NIH and get funding for their work. But right now, 5,000 stars at GitHub is just not it's not a verifiable credential to apply for a grant. So both in terms of biosafety, but also in terms of like economic and sort of creative opportunity, creating on-chain credentials is something that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, thank you. We've had quite a few people here today talking about on-chain credentials. Jan, you might see him. He has a fantastic project you should ask him about. This idea of sort of like having an on-chain credential system, a KYC system that abides by the traditional legal system, is what we adhere to now. However, in the decentralized space, there is a good chance that anonymity and distribution of open source resources and open access through transactional infrastructure will allow people to take part in some of these activities without necessary qualifications. I like, Nicholas, what you mentioned about Uniswap and SushiSwap. So this idea of taking a single piece of code, forking it, and then it being reiterated multiple times. SushiSwap was the most popular reiteration of Uniswap's code, but there were hundreds really of different reiterations of this, which came and went. The social consensus from the community was that Uniswap was the most, it had the most integrity, was the best run, had the staying power. So people use Uniswap. SushiSwap was sort of alongside it. So this kind of leads to the question: who decides where the staying power should be? Who is the moral arbiter of the space in DeSci? Is it the people within it that operate in it? Is it the builders, the founders of the projects, the people sat here? How do we decide as a decentralized space with complete freedom and sovereignty to decide on a collective code of ethics, which in a traditional system, the law or other sort of like legal structures would probably enforce, but in a decentralized system, how do we come to some kind of consensus?
I think that what I kind of see a little bit happening within the DeSci world, a lot of the things that we're facing have been addressed already by the traditional academic world and translational world, etc. And there are well-established norms and regulations around this, which I think we have to, for the most part, adhere to. And it's a bit like also in the DeFi world, like they're kind of now figuring out that all the rules and regulations and these things were in place for very good reasons. And there's some reinvention of wheels there. And I think that we can learn from the traditional world and what's already in place. And we need to kind of look at that to start with. But then we also need to be very collaborative, really, and talk openly together about this in very open forums, such as this, and come together to agree on how we're going to handle all this. I think that even in different countries, you're going to have different ethical norms, and what's good in one place might not be acceptable in another country. So that's going to have to be factored in. And again, kind of from my perspective, we want to drive this into solutions for society. Patient diseases is my particular focus, but it could be something like better photovoltaic cells, better battery chemistries, etc. And all of these things, there are actually already initiatives amongst us all to sit down and talk about this. You can find them online. But I think the most important thing is that we're continuing to be collaborative, meet up, discuss these things, and learn from the traditional existing things that are in place.
Unfortunately. So ethics is something I think we could talk about for about 3-4 hours at least. Unfortunately, we are at time for our panel, so I'd like to say thank you to all our wonderful panelists for coming and talking so eloquently about ethics. If you are interested in being a part of this collaborative sort of experience that Martin just mentioned. After the lunch break, there is a DeSci ethics workshop on the other stage, which we will be collaborating with the people that attend to try and create a sort of preliminary framework for ethics in DeSci. So please join if you're interested. And thank you everybody for listening.